It's not always about a destination. Sometimes, rather, it's about the journey. And it certainly will be here today, because in this video I want to discuss the different methods by which starships within the reality of the Ragnarök Chronicles can get from place to place. Hello and welcome to the Ragnarök Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is a channel where I just talk you through some of the elements within the books that I am writing. So usually when we're thinking about how ships in science fiction are going to get from one planet to the next, we might be thinking of something like a hyperdrive or warp drive or FTL, faster than light. Each of these have some kind of explanation usually within the whatever the science fiction franchise they are being brought up within. And for the ones that I'm using in my books as well, there may be some slight differences in those explanations given to those methods, just based upon the alternative structure of reality in the books, which I've broken down previously in my video on the nature of the multiverse. If you haven't seen that yet, I would suggest watching it, but of course I will go back over the relevant bits as I come to them, as well as also introducing some new alternative methods of starship engines, which again are tailored towards that more specific understanding of a potential reality. If we actually start with that which is relatively more practical, that being sublight, if we're going slow enough, we may in some franchises refer to this as impulse. So, I mean, technically the rockets that we have in real life right now are sublight vehicles, just because they travel less than the speed of light. But I suppose, strictly speaking, it could refer to anything below that limit of c, 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. Although if you're getting too close to it, then you have to decide if you're going to deal with relativistic masses, because basically the closer that you get to 100% the speed of light, the greater the mass involved becomes, until eventually, if an object was to travel at the speed of light, it will need infinite mass, which is why nothing can reach or break the speed of light. In theory, tachyons are a whole other thing. Anyway, that's just a thing. If we're usually thinking about sublight engines as a means of propelling a spaceship, that may be great, just travel between other ships in the fleet maybe, or from a planet to a moon, or something like that. But ultimately, given just how vast space is, even within a local system, unless you're prepared to either spend months, if not years, travelling from place to place, or alternatively you're happy to operate within a generation ship or go into cryosleep for the journey, the former of those two being where the original crew are not the ones who will be the ones to make the destination. It's either their children or their children's children or whoever will be the ones to finally get there. And the whole thing with either of those options in turn is, given how technology advances, if we were to send off a long duration ship of either of those kinds, by the time it got to its destination, it likely would have already have been beaten by some other ship that was sent later after we had developed like faster engines and so forth. So you could have a situation wherein you sent over the larger population who are going to end up populating a colony in that first generation ship or in cryosleep, and then you're banking on, at a later date in that period of time before the colony ship eventually arrives at the planet you wanted to go to, that you have then developed the technology that would be needed to quickly terraform the planet and so forth, as well as having those faster engines. So then the actual development ship can then overtake the colony ship and set everything up, and then the colony ship arrives. Unless you're going through a whole scenario like that, sublight drives aren't going to be great for any kind of long distance travel. Like, remember, everything is relative within space. There is so much distance to travel, even just to the nearest star. It's now, therefore, that we might turn to any of these other methods used for space travel, which might start to push what the laws of physics tell us should be possible for any of this kind of space travel. The first I'm going to talk about is that of subspace. Put probably too simply for it to really be properly defined, subspace is where you would shift your ship into a slightly different dimension wherein you aren't as bound by the normal laws of physics. Therefore, you can achieve some greater speed there, and then once you have travelled the given distance, you just return back to your normal plane of existence, having now travelled further than you otherwise would have been able to had you stuck to your regular reality. Within the Ragnarök Chronicles, subspace isn't necessarily something that's properly entered into, but it's made use of through the use of what is referred to as subspace conduits. Now, there's this race called the Palanthea, who I'll talk about another time. They didn't necessarily invent the idea of using subspace conduits, but they were definitely the one to really push the use of that kind of technology and make it pervasive, quite literally throughout the universe, with them sending back in time these kind of drone-like devices which could then go through the universe, setting up these conduits which could then continue building themselves in predetermined pathways, so that by the time you then get back to the present, from the Palanthea's point of view, these conduits now already exist, which then they can then make use of. So what you would be doing in this case is if, say, you had a UFO, such as this, within which obviously you are sitting, residing, it would connect itself to one of these conduits. So there's a one-way streams going through subspace, say through a hole in what could be usually considered as the top of the UFO and coming out the back as well. So through this fixed, closed-off channel that's heading straight through the UFO as such, your section around it therefore being in turn sealed off, both from the conduit and after you've got inside from the outside world as well. So you've connected to the conduit at this point, and then you would be pulled along that conduit at the speeds at which it is flowing within subspace, albeit while the rest of the ship is still existing in your regular plane of existence. And then obviously at a predetermined point, because you would know what your destination is because these are preset pathways, the computer would then shut off this channel through the centre, cutting your connection to the conduit, at which point you would then drop out again fully back into regular space. The reason why you want the bit in which the passengers are residing to be completely sealed off is because, again, the exterior, the hull of this ship is still therefore experiencing all of the forces and so forth that would be attributed to travelling at a speed which potentially is faster than the speed of light. If you could see out of it or interact with anything out of it, there could be some terrible consequences of distortions and so forth. This hull is reinforced, it is built to withstand those experiences, but the people inside aren't necessarily. Now, in turn, because of the vastness of space, these conduits are situated such that you're extremely unlikely to collide with anything as you're flying across. And in turn, even if someone knew where the conduit was and for some reason wanted to collide with it, because of how fast the UFO ends up moving, unless you've positioned this other thing directly in the way, the chance of collision are minimal. Now, there are exceptions to this in turn. For instance, the Palanthea at certain times have given this technology to other races as well, sometimes in ways that they regret it. For instance, there was one race called the Ravukal who used this technology to destructive means. For instance, they would establish a subspace conduit, which is then passing through a star, for instance, and then either set something up wherein matter from the star ends up getting sucked into the conduit and thus away from the rest of the star, or you use it to fly a ship containing some specific cargo into the star itself. Either way, therefore, causing an imbalance, which leads to the star exploding and wiping out potentially a solar system or something. So after those kinds of unintended uses of the technology started clearly becoming a problem, the Palanthea subsequently took a tighter hold over what could be done with it. Just to then return to the UFO again, in terms of the deceleration and acceleration, but I'm primarily thinking about the deceleration after exiting the subspace conduit, because again, the exterior of the ship, or technically the whole ship, has been moving that fast within real space. You do need some way to make the deceleration safer. Now, some other ships that are using completely different methods, they will make use of some distortion of time relative within the ship. Therefore, as their ship goes from whatever tremendous speed they've been using to travel between any 2 points in space, as they then decelerate rapidly at their destination, even though those people inside are still experiencing going from that greater speed to stopping point, for them, they are experiencing it relatively over a longer period of time. Therefore, it is a slower deceleration, therefore they suffer less of the forces that would come with it, so it's safer. In regards to the UFOs coming out of subspace conduits, as the system prepares itself to sever itself from the conduit itself, there is an ejection of some kind of matter which is used to lose some of the momentum, because within a closed system, the momentum at the beginning of something has to equal the momentum at the end. So if you fire off some other material that has momentum with it, you in turn, even if it's just a relatively small amount of recoil, are going to have less momentum at a slightly slower velocity afterwards, potentially. But also, again, it comes out of the subspace conduit. It's still traveling relatively fast, but it's lost all of the propulsion. So with that, tied with some advanced thrusters, basically, it's going to start decelerating as quickly and safely as it can, still travelling at many countless kilometres per second, but gradually slowing down and down. So that's why also, when you're using this kind of technology, you don't drop out right next to your destination. You drop out some way away, so that you then have that remaining distance to slow down within. Also, just generally showing that obviously it's moving this way, or you could think of it this way, either because the subspace conduit is travelling through the hole in the middle and out the back. The top is now technically the forward direction. The added benefit to that is that, from the perspective of the people inside, that now means that they can stand on the floor as such, as you would expect them to as well if the UFO was just kind of spinning around either near a planet or within like the atmosphere of a planet, where you would expect the gravity going downwards, you want to stand on the floor. What I'm trying to get at is that unless you're talking about a race in which you can just kind of say, oh, they have artificial gravity, doesn't matter the orientation of the floors within the ship. If you say that they're not that kind of race that has that kind of technology, whenever you're thinking about a spaceship, you have to consider which way is it travelling, because whichever way is forwards, the perceived gravity is going to be the opposite direction. Right? If I just move very quickly like this, going forwards, for the people inside, they're going to be experiencing a force akin to gravity pushing them against this back wall, which you don't want. What you want is them to be pushed feet down into the floor, and that's kind of a way in which artificial gravity could work. So for instance, if you're accelerating in such a way that the people are accelerating at 9.81 meters per second squared into the floor, they would be experiencing the equivalent of Earth's gravity. So that's how they would feel relatively normal. Again, if we're talking about people from Earth, if you're looking at creatures from another planet, which due to a variety of other factors has a different gravity, they'd want to accelerate differently. Yes, your flaws of any kind of interior design of ship should always end up perpendicular to the engine. Yes, if the engine, the booster is going down this way, the floor should be like that, because as you're going up, the people are going to be pushed down into that floor, unless you want them to be flung back into a wall. Yeah, there's dangers in turn regarding that, as well as with the sudden stopping, same degree. If you don't have any of these kind of safety measures that I've been trying to describe, you end up instead with people being splattered either against the back wall or the front wall. And if you want to see that, I would suggest instead watching a show called The Expanse, which is on Amazon, which is again praised for kind of how scientifically accurate comparative to other shows it can be. Okay, so that's kind of your subspace. And so talking about how this still results in the vehicle, relatively speaking, travelling at immense speeds within the main reality. If you want to avoid the whole subspace route, in theory, you could go for a more traditional fast and light FTL drive. Now, again, we get into matters of relativistic speeds and so forth, and it's just a lot of effort and complication, really. So, in fact, throughout all of the Ragnarök Chronicles, multiverse and timeline for all the races and all the ships that may appear, both in the stories and inevitably countless many more times outside of the stories, I, at least in my own head, only have 3 ships, I think, that use fast and light travel two of which belong to humans in like the mid 22nd century, and only due to extraterrestrial intervention in turn. I've explained previously that the Alpha Realm, I'd say previously in a previous video, the Alpha Realm, our plane of existence, contrary to how we perceive it, is actually made up of a chain of static bubble universes, and our souls, our consciousnesses, are just moving between those universes at such a fast rate that to us it feels fluid and natural. It's like the ultimate stop-motion film. And how reality basically guarantees that it all flows in a way that makes sense is that there is this kind of cosmic algorithm built into the fabric of reality itself, which basically determines for every single possible factor what is the most likely outcome of each event, and therefore it makes sure that the next universe in the chain would be that matter of progression. You essentially have a universe-wide computer that can calculate all of these different variables perpetually. Again, also, it having to have that extra work when you get in the complications of time travellers, trying to change those course of events, and thus causing the spawning of more universes to have different outcomes occurring because of it. How the FTL drive would basically work then is that it's still an engine that would allow you to perpetually accelerate, essentially, but there's also an added element which tricks the reality's algorithm into basically not providing you with the consequences of going at relativistic speeds. It glitches out and allows you to just keep on accelerating that quickly and then sustain yourself at those greater speeds, so long as that, for however long you want to be travelling at FTL at, which is why there are so few people, so few races that will be using FTL, because it requires that level of understanding of how the very fabric of reality works. Now, if we leave the Alpha Realm and also go into the outer region, which again, as explained previously, operates more like how we think of the universe as actually operating. It's also said there that the laws of physics which exist in the Alpha Realm, which are partly in place, put there by that algorithm as kind of some parameters within which it can work, those laws of physics aren't quite the same in the outer region, kind of like I was describing for the general idea of subspace. So there just isn't that same speed of light limit. It is different out there. You can just travel faster than your 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. So it is easier in turn to do FTL out there as well, but again, you still need the technology to accelerate you that fast for that whatever duration in a safe manner. Then in turn, for that duration itself, for the journey, unlike with the Subspace Conduits, which had already been pre-established, you don't have anything to stop you necessarily while in FTL accidentally colliding with something if you don't know exactly where you're going. That's why, with the human-owned ships in the middle of the 22nd century, if they're going down a path through space which they haven't been through before, which in fairness isn't often, these ships end up just being really used for one journey backwards and forwards. If they're taking a new journey, what they'll have is these automated arrays which get fired ahead of the ship, like periodically, which scan the space ahead and transmit the information back. Now, of course, if this ship is already travelling faster than the speed of light, how can it fire these things ahead and also get the information backwards and forwards? Velocity is all relative. It's like if you were to run down the length of a train, are you actually running at whatever velocity the train is travelling at? No, you as a person can't independently go that fast. From your perspective, you're just going your regular running speed. But from someone on the outside, it would appear like that. So from the perspective of the ships that are travelling, they are able to, within reason, fire out these kind of scanning arrays ahead of themselves, just as best they can, an early warning system, just in case there's anything in front of them. And then those arrays get left behind as kind of like trail markers if they want to go that way again, still checking out to see if anything has changed. So, since I keep on having to give so many caveats to that, what could be perhaps a bit quote-unquote simpler? Well, let's now move on to hyperdrives. There's two main types of hyperdrive within the Ragnarök Chronicles, which more or less use the same principles. There's just some subtle differences here and there. Again, another thing I've explained previously is the idea of devices whose name would translate into English as hexagons. These being a matter of 6 arrays around a person, thing or place, which generate a bubble of artificial outer region reality within the Alpha Realm. which if you're within this bubble, you are therefore outside of the flow of time that's going through the Alpha Realm. You are existing in this one moment, this one universe. And as such, if a ship, for instance, was to have a ship-wide hexagon, establish itself around it, it would be taken out of the main flow of time. This ship could then fly to its destination using regular engines, and then enter normal space again, and from the point of view of everyone else, it would have been instantaneously gone from point A to point B. Now, from the perspective of the ship, it still needs to make that journey over whatever duration of time. So you're still at that point probably going to have additional systems which put the interior of the ship into some kind of suspended animation so they don't experience the journey. And you also want to make sure that the ship has sustained engines and enough fuel to make that journey, otherwise it's just going to shut down everything midway through the journey, it's going to drop back in somewhere else. So it's still gone through hyperspace, just not all of the way. This would only really work within the Alpha Realm, or the inner region, I suppose, but again, I've talked about how they're kind of similar to each other before. Anyway, I'm going to mainly talk about the Alpha Realm. If you want a slightly different type of hyperdrive which could work anywhere, then instead you give the ship this kind of mechanism which generates a form of pulse, of a sort of matter which kind of can pass through anything else within anything in the universe really. It's kind of its own independent substance. So if you've emitted this pulse out from the ship, it kind of then envelops the ship itself and carries it with it to whatever destination you fired it towards. And based on the calculations of the engine and so forth, it would give it enough speed and velocity and so forth to carry you forth to that destination, by which point it would then have dissipated and you would have been let back into the regular reality. As such, you don't have any agency to change your path or direction after you've set off, unlike with the hexagons. But again, like the hexagons, like with these hyperdrives, the nature of this pulse is that again it would take you outside of the time stream of the Alpha Realm. If you then used it to pass on into the outer region, then it's just regular business. Everyone will be able to see what you're doing, but they wouldn't be able to interact with you. You're kind of safe within that pulse until, as I say, it dissipates at the other end. This technology doesn't have to be used with ships either. You also have a number of archways, referred to as the Eodon, at least the one on Earth is called that, which use that exact same principle. Within the archway, it generates such a pulse which would envelop any personal persons passing through the archway to carry them over to any other destination within the universe. It doesn't even have to be another location with a corresponding archway, but of course you would likely want to go to such a place because then you can get back again. In that case also, you don't have a choice about whether you're conscious through the trip or not. The pulse would mean that you don't experience the journey at all. You just would be aware of going in one end and coming out the other. These hyperdrive styles that I've just described, therefore, are the most common type of starship propulsion that you're going to find within the reality of the Ragnarök Chronicles. For those technologically advanced enough species who are so inclined to travel between what inhabited or habitable worlds there are within their relative corner of space. That then leaves us with just two more to discuss. Two that, again, are kind of more very specifically designed for the structure of the multiverse that I have in these books, and therefore don't have names for me already to work with. Whether I'll come up with names for them eventually, I don't know, but regardless, they're both also rather unique and rare in terms of their usage. I already mentioned, obviously, the FTL drives were rare as well, but at least that had a pre-existing name I could work with. The first one of the two was only ever used by one species during what could be thought of as the first war or conflict within this current iteration of the multiverse, that being the Beta Incursion, an event that I'll talk about another time in more detail. This race, the Virol, rather than always relying on propulsion engines as most will, they instead made use of another quirk of the nature of reality itself. Once more, referring back to the structure of the multiverse, I've mentioned how between the Alpha Realm and the Inner Region, there is technically this fifth layer of reality, this kind of friction somewhat that's formed between those two planes of existence, kind of competing with each other to exist within more or less the same space. Even in points such as a vacuum, where there aren't many atoms, if any at all, although you have to acknowledge that space isn't a perfect vacuum. Even if there aren't atoms around, this layer of friction still exists because you still have the alpha and the inner region competing with each other. So what the Viral would also do is they invented mechanisms which could essentially touch and interact with this fifth plane, clawing their ships along it, almost like tracks on treadmills or wheels or stuff. So rather than flying per se, they were literally like driving over and across and through the skin of reality itself. Now, this isn't the most efficient way to go about things, and again, they are the only race to have ever done it. But it is an alternative that they discovered and made use of on certain occasions. Final one, only one ship have ever used it. And this ship is referred to as the Legacy. I've mentioned this before in the video on Angels. The Legacy was the ship built by those who knew that the previous iteration of the multiverse was going to come to an end, and used it to survive the Big Bang. Now, the crew of the Legacy, as it happened, didn't actually make it through the events due to other circumstances involving the Angels, and the ship was thus left just generally flying through reality, searching for something. Other people have since then come across the ship and boarded it and tried to use it as their own, and during that time they perfectly are able to, but then afterwards, when it either escapes or they give it up, it continues on its own journey. Those who for these periods are able to get a better understanding of the ship's systems, though, again bearing in mind it's not made by any species that they would be familiar with, so it would take some time to properly come to understand it, if they can at all, those who do end up with that greater understanding may discover that it actually has a mechanism by which it can immobilize, freeze the entirety of the rest of the multiverse, more or less instantaneously. So it's basically like what the hyperdrive was doing with the hexagons, but on an entire reality-based scale, regardless of which dimension you're in. And the reason this is even possible is because, again, these people who built the Legacy were the same people who were aware of what was happening to the universe as well, and so were able to build the ship with that kind of universal understanding in mind. So yes, if you wished to use that drive, it would freeze everyone else, no one would be aware of this after the fact, and then you could just pilot the Legacy anywhere you wanted to go. This field, which pauses everyone else, it's very quickly to dissipate, so the Legacy is perpetually pumping out this kind of effect. And so once you want to drop back into the regular time stream, you just shut off that drive, and as soon as those kind of waves have quickly dissipated, everything just resumes, and again, from everyone else's perspective, it looks like you've literally just appeared out of nowhere from wherever you were previously. Okay, so that is a breakdown of all of the main ways in which any of the various races throughout the Ragnarök Chronicles might be propelling their ships to get from one place to another in something of a relatively efficient manner, depending on what their priorities and motives are. Hopefully you found that interesting, as you may some of the other videos on this channel as well. So until I see you again, just remember to keep on telling stories. Well, if you've been looking at the time bar, you'll realise that isn't actually the end of the video. I just want to take this opportunity, since we're talking about spaceships, to do a little bit of an end tag about just coming up with those kind of things as well, design-wise. So I'm the kind of person who just generally likes to take any kind of objects that may be around me and turn them into, doesn't have to be spaceships, just devices or locations or whatever I might be looking for. Again, not always with intentions either, just see what comes about and then find a place for it. Of course, if you are thinking about using or turning objects into other things, the easiest thing to do for that is literally just to work with Lego. Like, you can just make certain spaceships out of that as their own designs. I don't care what some people have previously said to me, Legos are great, you should play with them if you want to do some, use them as a creative outlet kind of thing. So like you can make whatever these ships are meant to be, including like escape pods and stuff like that. So this could be a mining ship, for instance. Alternatively, if you were like me when I was younger and you literally just like, go out to a country park or something like that and just start, not that you should just go around picking stuff up off the ground, but like rocks and stones and metal and stuff like that. Not always, again, a spaceship, but say just something like this. We just notice, okay, You could hold that between your fingers like this. Maybe this could be the general shape of some kind of device which you would use to maybe pick something up, like it would attach on these nodes. You just connect it to the surface and then you could lift it with it. Or, as I was really kind of alluding to before, I'm mainly talking about pre-existing objects that you may just have around you, which again, finding alternative purposes for. For instance, this fountain pen, which yes, the lid isn't matching the casing, but whatever. In this case, we could be looking at a ship wherein this is actually the main body, the lid here. The window at the front is acting both as a view screen, which actually I visualized with protractors previously, like 2 protractors, which could then unhinge open forwards to let you step in and out, so it also acts as a door. This little ramp bit at the bottom here, we could also imagine that there's another one here and here to have 3 in total, both to act as kind of things that have wheels on, or they could attach to railings in the launch system so it would come out through a tube. But also these could then unfold things from out the sides to then have some maybe spherical artillery roll out onto them and be fired, some kind of smaller projectile weaponry. For the main weapon, though, because again this is a battleship, like a battle shuttle thing, like a few people sitting in the front cabin here, you then have this main missile-based thing, which would contain some kind of fluid material in its canister, which then, once you have your main target, you have these arms along the sides, which could lever this forward and up, and then this would fire forward into the thing. And when it therefore impacts with other objects, the fluid which was inside of the canister is not just necessarily being explosive, but maybe is more corrosive, or does something to the material that causes it to break down, maybe even splatter onto other nearby ships to have a chain reaction. If it came down to it that the ship basically it was going to crash and the captain's going to go down with the ship, you could also have a thing wherein this jutted forwards into the cabin itself, causing the main part of the ship to similarly break apart and have that spraying effect. That's just a ship idea, which again is implemented in one of the sub-series that I just came up with in secondary school, just again by looking at this fountain pen. Alternatively, if you have a set of compasses, what we can say is if it's flying normally like this, you have kind of an omnidirectional propulsion system at the back here, like how the different fins and stuff position themselves. It can alter the way in which it's propelling you. On this side here, for instance, where you've got the little bit from the screw, that could be like a spherical cabin which can turn around to give you different perspectives, but would mainly be looking down the side of the ship here, with the other main bridge then being this bit on top here. Of course, probably, when I am thinking of turning this into a ship, I'm probably going to be reducing this bit around here because that is kind of bulky and in a way. But still, we could have some kind of mechanism therefore along the top, which is used to hold on to cargo. That can still have a use for this here. And then this bit on the bottom here with the spike, maybe we have a thing where, even though on this side of the screw here, we have some kind of turret system, which again can fire in different directions, the main uber weapon that you'd only use under dire circumstances is that if this one actually extended out to meet here, the 2 tips would touch together, and the contact of the 2 points there would then trigger some other major firing system. As for when it lands, however, we would turn it onto its side so that the bit that the cabin area here is at the top. The 2 sections here can open up, wherein your legs would kind of fold out from inside of the 2 arms, as well as from around the turret, so it can land like this. So you also notice when you open this up, it pushes forward this bit here. That potentially could then fold forward to be like a ramp to exit through, so forth. Again, just another thing, an example of, in secondary school, just with a piece of stationery. I was focusing in class, I promise, but just a piece of stationery that you have in class, you can turn that just into some other thing for a story. Doesn't have to be a ship, but that tends to be what my brain tends towards. Alternatively, the other thing I came up with is in turn a kind of turret. If this is at the base, you can kind of put this up here, depending on the size of your turret. Maybe someone sitting in this part here, but either way, you can then have this be where projectiles come out, or lasers, whatever. Point is, if you were trying to come up with something for your story. Either you're actively trying to think, what could the design of this thing be, or you just feel like being imaginative. It doesn't all just have to be within your head. I often find in my imagination is tactile, just finding anything around you in your personal space, just play around with and just think, could that look like something else in another environment with different scaling? Tip there if you just want to come up with such items and details to flesh out your world with of your own.